underscore Eliza. Now, the upcoming G20 summit will be the most significant meeting of world leaders Australia has ever hosted. Josh Frydenberg is Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister and has spent much of the last year representing the Prime Minister at G20 meetings. And earlier we asked him about the Coalition's response to the opposition bill Shorten, claiming that Mr Abbott's promise to shirt-front the Russian leader Vladimir Putin was out of line.
I'd reject that criticism entirely. I mean, Tony Abbott has handled himself extremely well during this very difficult time after the downing of flight MH17. He will have a very robust discussion with the Russian president, just as the Australian people would expect him to. 38 people who called Australia home lost their lives with the tragic downing of a civilian airliner, and we need to make sure that the Russians don't impede any further investigation of the crash site and our attempts and the international community's attempts to bring the perpetrators of that crime to justice.
The Prime Minister has indicated that he will talk to the Russian President ahead of the APEC meeting. Can we also expect the issue, though, to be raised at the G20?
Well, they will certainly have a very robust discussion in Beijing, and no doubt in further discussions the issue may come up too. But the point is, we want unimpeded access to the crash site. We want to ensure that remains of those victims can come back to their families at home, and we also want to find the perpetrators of that crime. And Tony Abbott has been very outspoken in pointing the finger, and I think he has seen the rest of the international community follow him in that respect. And both he and Julie Bishop have handled this issue extremely well, considering how delicate and sensitive it is.
But do you think that this issue will overshadow the G20?
No, I don't. The G20 is essentially an economic forum, and there's been meetings right through the year of finance ministers and labour ministers and trade ministers, and there's a very comprehensive agenda, particularly around the target of boosting global growth by 2% over the next 5 years on top of what it would already be. We believe the G20 can achieve a lot in terms of trade facilitation, job creation, building greater investment into infrastructure, the financial sector's resilience, so that we can withstand the shock of another financial crisis whenever that occurs. There's a very big agenda where all the countries represented at the G20 have a real stake in constructive and positive outcomes. So I don't believe it will be overshadowed by the events in Ukraine or the events in Syria and Iraq, or dare I say it, the tragedy of the Ebola crisis spreading too.
Is tax avoidance also likely to be discussed? Obviously that has made news recently with the focus on many multinational corporations avoiding tax in countries such as Australia.
Well, you're right. Profit shifting, tax base erosion is an important topic on the agenda at the G20. What we're seeing with the digitalisation of the economy and the growing role of multinationals is a number of companies are not paying tax in the jurisdictions in which they earn that particular income. So we are supporting greater information sharing between jurisdictions, greater transparency and accountability, because it's not just Australia who's facing this challenge in terms of seeing tax revenue foregone, but it's also other major jurisdictions around the world who are represented at the G20.
Josh Frydenberg, can we also turn our attention to tax revenue at home? Now, specifically talk of the GST and perhaps increasing it or at least broadening it. Now, there is news and some papers this morning that the Prime Minister has been canvassing the issue with certain interested parties. Do you feel as though it is inevitable that before the next election the GST will either rise or its base will be broadened?
No, I don't think it's inevitable. I do think that we need to have a considered and constructive discussion in this country about tax reform. Ken Henry pointed out in his important review during the term of the last government that we have 125 taxes in this country, but just 10 of those taxes produce 90% of the revenue. We have 115 taxes producing just 10% of the revenue. So we need broad-based tax reform, but unlike the Labor Party, we're prepared to have the GST put on the table and considered as part of a white paper on tax.
And will that be part of the policy at the next election?
Well, with no plans to lift the GST at all, but what we have said is let's have a discussion about tax reform and let's not exclude the GST from that discussion. In fact, it's the Labor Party who secretly commissioned modelling during their term in government about lifting the GST. They're the ones who need to come open and be transparent with the Australian people about what they really think about the GST in this country and whether it should move upwards.
Now, the Prime Minister has called for a bipartisan approach to this, saying that we do need to recognise that Australia's revenue base has to be broadened. You're now saying that Labor has to be more transparent on this issue. Do you have to change the discussion around taxation to be more inclusive?
Well, you're absolutely right. We need to take the public with us about any tax reform because it's obviously a delicate subject. And you need not just the government being advocates for change, you also need key players in the community, both the business community, industry groups and the like, but also other stakeholders, community organisations, who can understand the need to ensure a simpler, fairer tax system. You see, in Australia we have a problem, and that's called a structural deficit. We are spending more than we're taking in terms of revenue, and that was pointed out by the Commission of Audit. And unless we are able to bring spending under control and get our revenue to the right place in terms of a reliable stream of revenue over time, then the economy will suffer and we'll have budget deficits and budget blowouts as far as the eye can see. And who pays for that? Not just the current generation, but the next generation, because debt is a legacy of bad government, and we saw that from the last government, and we don't want that to be the legacy of this government.
Josh Frydenberg, excuse me, you're not doing the Napthine government in Victoria any favours, are you, when you're talking about GST at this point, coupled with, of course, a change to the fuel tax, just 3 weeks out from an election in Victoria? The incumbent government is under significant pressure, you must admit.
Well, it's going to be a close election, and certainly the polls haven't been tracking as fair in the direction that we had hoped. But at the same time, the Napthine government has a great case. They have been a very good government. They are the only state government in the country with a AAA credit rating, so their budgetary performance, producing budget surpluses, has been the envy of other states, and that means less debt, less the interest bill, more money for health and education.
If they've been going so well, though, sorry to interrupt, Mr Frydenberg, but if they've been going so well, why are they on the nose?
We have to keep making the case, and people shouldn't feel complacent enough to change their vote at the next election, because if we allow Daniel Andrews back in, it means more power to the CFMEU, more power to the unions, less productivity in the economy. We won't have the major infrastructure projects like the East-West Link or the widening of the Tullamarine Freeway or the regional rail link. All these major changes are initiatives of the Napthine and coalition team. So more infrastructure, more security on our train stations with the PSOs, better budgetary management. That's a pretty good record for Denis Napthine and his team to run on.
So I'm
very hopeful they can win.
Are they failing to sell their record there? Does this come down to perhaps a lack of strong leadership in Victoria?
Not at all. I think Denis Napthine is a very strong and effective leader. And what an amazing personal story. He's one of 10 children. And he had a career as a vet before coming into politics. An amazing personal story. But we have to just focus the people's attention on our achievements, but also the threats that Labor represent. And in Victoria, we've had the Spring Racing Carnival in recent days, and it has to be said, it's very hard for a politician to get airtime during that carnival. So I think people's attention is now just starting to focus on the election in a few weeks' time, and hopefully those polls can turn around and the Napthine government, which has been a very good government, can be re-elected.
It'll be a big 3 weeks. Josh Frydenberg, thank you very much for your time.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
They were